Hi friends, my name is JT. If you haven't seen these videos before or you haven't watched my previous two, I am doing a research project for my Women's and Gender Studies class for my capstone, and this is the format that I decided to do. So I'm doing a series on what it's like to be trans, drawing from research and personal experience and the experiences of other trans people. So if that's something that'll interest you, that's what these videos are going to be about. If you haven't seen my first two videos, I had one about gender dysphoria and the process of coming out. Those are good videos if you don't have much of a base of knowledge about trans people. Those give some pretty preliminary ideas about what it's like to be trans in regards to coming out and gender dysphoria. But this video is actually going to be about misgendering and the use of pronouns, which tends to be a pretty divisive and controversial topic even within the trans community. So let's go ahead and get started. First, we're going to talk about pronoun usage. First and foremost, I feel like we just need to define what pronouns are, which may seem very basic, but pronouns are words that are used in place of a noun. It's usually because it helps the flow of sentences, because it's weird to say like, oh yeah, JT went to the store because JT likes to buy fruit. That sounds weird in a lot of languages, and so we have pronouns that we use to replace those names, or it can also replace another object. In the English language, the masculine pronouns tend to be he, him, his. The feminine pronouns are she, her, hers. And then the traditional gender-neutral pronoun that is used for plural or singular is they, them, theirs. Another discussion topic surrounding the types of pronouns would be neopronouns. This can be things like, if you've ever heard of like ze, zer, them, ze, zer, zers, or there's just like a wide variety of other neopronouns that people may go by. I will say I live on a pretty liberal college campus. I've never really met anybody that uses neopronouns. I feel like in the media, it's kind of made out to be something that's like very prevalent and something that's like looming and it's super scary. I've never really met anybody with neopronouns. So when it comes to who actually uses pronouns, contrary to some people's beliefs, everybody has and uses pronouns. It would actually be quite unnatural to not use pronouns and avoid pronoun usage. That's not really how our language functions, at least in English, and so trying to avoid the use of pronouns would be pretty much impossible for the average person. And people will say that, like when asked their pronouns, for example, people will say that they don't have any or they don't like that, they don't use those. And this isn't a factual statement. This is more of a political statement, and there's actually a good example of this. There was a Fox News interview where the interviewer was talking to Donald Trump and talking about Kamala Harris having she, her pronouns in her bio. And then the reporter asks Donald Trump what his pronouns are. I will insert that clip here.
Kamala Harris in her Twitter bio, which I never noticed until this morning, states her pronouns as she/her. What are your pronouns?
I don't want pronouns. I don't want pronouns. I saw
So
that.
you're fluid? What is that?
Nobody even knows what that means. Ask her to describe exactly what that means.
What is that? Why are people
Nobody
doing that?
knows.
So while this is the president that is giving these responses, this actually is a response that a lot of people feel. Even if they don't say it, they may feel it regarding the topic of pronouns because they're uncomfortable and it doesn't really align with their political beliefs. I kind of want to talk about why people actually use gender-neutral pronouns. And I feel like a lot of people think that it may be for attention or that they just want to stand out. That's really not the case. So I want to bring up an example of just one of millions of reasons that a person may decide that they want to use gender-neutral pronouns instead of he or she. The gendered pronouns that we use, he and she, hold a lot more connotation around them than the average person may realize. So I want to take this for example. say I'm like a 16-year-old girl and I want to go hang out with somebody, and I tell my parents, hey, I'm going to go get dinner with him tonight. Or, hey, I'm going to go get dinner with her tonight. The perceptions that your parents are going to have are going to differ so widely depending on whether or not you say him or her. And people that are non binary or use gender neutral pronouns kind of just want to avoid those connotations that those gendered pronouns have. If a young girl says that she's going to go get dinner with him, that may imply some sort of like date, or the parents might be more concerned than if the young girl was to say that she was going to get dinner with another girl. When you say, hey, mom, dad, I'm going to go get dinner with them tonight, that removes any like preconceived notions that anybody could have about the person that you're going to hang out with. And again, that's just one example, but those connotations are surrounding these gendered pronouns more than anybody realizes. Another thing that people like to say is that they and them are only used for groups of people or multiple people. And while it is true that they and them are used in the plural, it is true that they're also used in the singular. We usually use these many, many, many times a day, but we don't really realize it because we use it so often. So again, say I tell my parents, hey, I'm going to my friend's house, and they respond, oh, where do they live? That was a prime example of using they or them in a singular format. Moving on to specific scenarios, one question that a lot of people have, and the preferences can widely vary, but should I announce my pronouns anytime that I introduce myself? And again, this really is just personal preference, and you don't have to if you don't want to, but I will say a lot of cisgender people like reject the idea of stating their pronouns when introducing themselves because they think that their gender identity is obvious, or say I'm completely female presenting and I say that my pronouns are she, her. Well, that kind of may sound redundant to somebody, but what I feel like a lot of people don't understand is that you're not really stating your pronouns for yourself. And that sounds weird, but to be most inclusive of everybody in the room, if you just state your pronouns, that tells other people in the room that if they have pronouns that they want to share, that they're safe to do so, or that they can feel more comfortable doing so, rather than them being the only one in the room that's expressing their pronouns. And that kind of puts a spotlight on the person that is trans or the person that uses different pronouns from the ones that they were assigned. As a trans person, if nobody in the room is stating their pronouns during an introduction, I may feel really awkward to bring up the fact that I use different pronouns than what I was assigned at birth. So, if somebody doesn't express their pronouns when you meet them, should you ask people for their pronouns? And I would say, again, this is really up to you, but it is good practice to ask people their pronouns. But honestly, even within the trans community, there's some discourse about whether or not you should be asking trans people their pronouns if they're not telling you. And it's funny because that may sound contradictory, but again, that kind of just goes to show that a lot of trans people have differing opinions on so many different things, and it's definitely not like a monolith. But basically, some people do appreciate being asked their pronouns because it shows that you want to put in an effort to respect their identity and respect what they want to be called. But then there's also people in the trans community who don't appreciate it because it feels like it brings a level of discomfort because it feels like you are pointing out that they're trans and asking their pronouns because they're trans, which is why it may be best to just get into the habit of asking every single person their pronouns, because you really never know and you can't tell just by looking at people. If you see somebody that is like more gender bending or they're more androgynous, I would say that like the most safe way to proceed is just either use gender neutral pronouns, so they, them, or you could even use the pronouns that you think that they are trying to present as. Just being realistic and honest, not every single trans person is going to pass as cisgender at every point in their transition. That's just not realistic. I'm at a point right now in my transition where I don't pass, and so if you meet somebody who you know may be transgender and it's obvious that they are trying to present as something that's different than they were assigned at birth, use the pronouns that you think that they would want you to use. And if you get it wrong, they'll correct you. Whether that's in that moment or later, they would likely correct you. Just realize that your decision to use those pronouns in that moment is really affirming to that person, and it could be something that like makes their day. So keep that in mind when interacting with literally anybody. So as I mentioned, there is just a wide variety of ideas about the trans community within the trans community, and a lot of trans people, specifically trans people who are binary, so trans men and trans women, can sometimes look at people who are more androgynous or non-binary and say that they don't understand it, or that they're not going to respect those pronouns because they don't understand it. You're either a trans man or you're a trans woman, like pick one or shut up. And I do think that this maybe is because of the fact that we as trans people have had a lot of that same treatment from cisgender people. And so I think they're trying to pass it on to a community that is a lot of times more vulnerable. That's just my personal opinion, and it kind of is just speculation based on what I know about trans people. So if you're trans and you're watching this video, it's likely that you know the name Blair White. She is a trans YouTuber. She does a lot of political commentary, and she is famous for her conservative views because there's really not a lot of trans people that display any sort of conservative views, and she's very outspoken. And one of the interesting things that she believes is people using your pronouns correctly is something that's earned through hard work and time putting into your transition. So a person may not deserve to be called she, her if they haven't taken steps towards their transition, or if they haven't reached a point yet in their transition where it may feel natural to call them she, her. Blair kind of thinks that if you just expect people to call you the pronouns that you wish people to call you, if you don't present that way fully yet, that it's kind of entitled or narcissistic to just try and change the way that people around you think and speak. I do think that this is kind of an unfortunate way to view things, just because it really disregards a lot of the factors that could prevent somebody from being able to make steps towards their transition. We'll definitely get into this in a later video, but transitioning is not easy and it's not cheap, and it's also really difficult to do if you don't have people around you that are supportive. A lot of people don't have the money, the thousands of dollars that it takes to have these gender affirming surgeries, and so to say that these people don't deserve to be called the pronouns that they wish to be called, it hurts a little bit, just because, like I mentioned earlier, you could really make somebody's day by using the correct pronouns in a way, and like it could affect them positively in ways that you don't even realize. And if you recall from my last video, it can lessen gender dysphoria because it's less of a reminder of the sex that you were assigned at birth, and so that's really helpful for trans people in terms of mental health. So I do wish that we could see a decline in this type of belief system surrounding trans identities, because I think that people who are really late in their transition and they pass really well can forget kind of what it's like to be on the complete other side of things and to feel that gender dysphoria so strongly. To call it entitled is a little bit sad. Now I want to move on to the part of the video where I will talk about misgendering, which, wow, if you go onto Google or you go onto YouTube and you look up the words misgendering, the amount of like troll commentary that pops up is actually kind of crazy. There's not one video that pops up in the top searches that's like pro-trans people. It's almost all videos of cisgender people who are making fun of trans people for being upset about being misgendered, which I thought was interesting and I wasn't really expecting. But I guess, especially with the way that things are in the world as of March 2025, it makes sense that that would be like the public and societal view. Also, if you're not experiencing gender dysphoria, I could see why it wouldn't make sense to a lot of people why misgendering is upsetting, but I'm going to get into that now. Again, I want to start off with the basics here and just define what misgendering is. I'm going to pull this definition from a 2021 article by Howansky. I think that's how you pronounce it. And this article defines misgendering as using pronouns that are inconsistent with one's gender identity. And then this can also include other gendered language that we use that aren't really pronouns, but things like sir or ma'am, or words like son or daughter. And there is actually kind of two types of misgendering. And the first is just like traditional misgendering, which I just talked about, which is using the wrong pronouns. There's also degendering, which is a newer topic, but I do believe that it is just as prevalent and it's not talked about as much. So the definition from that same 2021 article is abstaining from the use of pronouns or refusing to categorize somebody's gender identity. Which kind of sounds weird at first, but basically that could look like a trans woman introducing herself to me, and then when I speak about this trans woman, I will use like they them pronouns, which I know is not the pronouns that a trans woman would want to use, but again, refusing to categorize her gender identity. So choosing to use gender neutral language or abstaining from pronoun usage altogether and just using her name or something like that, that would be considered degendering. And obviously vice versa for trans men, refusing to use he, him pronouns for a trans man and just using they, them instead. And this article did actually find that across all trials, men were more likely to degender trans women, even if their pronouns were provided. So it is something that is prevalent and does deserve discussion. I think something that's really interesting is that this is something that I'm even guilty of, which I didn't even realize. If you go back and watch my last video, I was speaking about a video from Jamie Dodger, and I only referred to him pretty much with gender neutral pronouns almost every time I referenced him, which is interesting because obviously as a trans person, I mean, hey, I like to think I don't have any negative or prejudiced views towards trans people, but degendering is something I still find myself doing. And I think for me, it's mainly because I have gotten to know a lot more non-binary people in my life, and so I've just gotten more accustomed to using they them pronouns. Even for cisgender people, sometimes it just naturally it feels right in the moment to say they them, but I do find myself thinking that this person is not conforming to gender the same way that a cisgender person is, so my brain just automatically goes they them. So that's definitely something I'll work on. While I do think that the overall effects of degendering can be just as harmful because, again, you're not really affirming the person's gender identity, the intentions are not always bad, clearly, and it can happen by genuine mistake. And as I mentioned, it usually does stem from not wanting to make a mistake with pronouns. And so the easiest way can just be to pick gender neutral. But really, if you do know somebody's pronouns and you've been told or have seen somebody's pronouns in their bio or something, and then you explicitly decide to use they them pronouns, that is kind of refusing to affirm their gender identity in a way. So, for example, I'll use myself, right? I am a trans woman. Crazy to say that, and people would probably be mad that I categorize myself that way because I'm not completely feminine presenting yet. But because of that, when people refer to me using they them pronouns, it's actually quite affirming to me that at least like I don't present masculinely. But for somebody that is far later in their transition, when you embody what it means to be a man or a woman and you have put in all that work into your transition and you clearly look like, say you're a trans woman, right? And you clearly look like a she, her, and it really should be natural for people to use she, her, and they decide to use gender neutral pronouns, that can feel kind of like a slap in the face a little bit. But why does misgendering happen? In my opinion, there's kind of two main reasons that this happens. The first being accidental, and the second being on purpose. So, as it sounds like, the accidental misgendering happens on accident. It's by mistake. And usually this happens because when we see a person, our initial instinct is to use the pronoun that matches their physical presentation in terms of gender. So many people would see me and say he, and that is technically misgendering. That's not necessarily the person's fault if they've never met me before, right? It's because I don't present feminine yet most of the time. If I were to meet a non-binary person and walk up to them, never met them before, and my brain registers that person as female, I will likely use she, her pronouns naturally. And I hope that they would correct me, but without knowing anything, instinctively, I would probably use feminine pronouns. This is something that ContraPoints, again, if you're trans and you're watching this video, you probably know who ContraPoints is, but she has such an amazing video on pronouns. All of her videos are amazing. They're very like production videos where she really dives into social topics, but she really has this good video on pronouns where she breaks down the origins of pronouns. She also talks about this concept of the pronoun being what is used based on instinctually what we see when we look at other people. And again, like it sounds, the second one was doing it on purpose. That's when people have the intention of purposely not following gender ideology or not believing in gender ideology, so they decide to use the pronouns that are consistent with the sex that somebody was assigned at birth, even if somebody is told that they don't want to be using those pronouns. What I think is interesting is that people who decide to purposely misgender somebody will even do so if it feels unnatural. And I will insert this clip right now.
Transgender woman from Orange is the New Black.
I never watched that show.
I've never watched that show either, but she's on the cover of Time magazine.
Oh.
Or he's on the cover of Time magazine.
That was pretty famous conservative political commentator Ben Shapiro, where he actually used the trans woman's correct pronouns on accident, but then decided to correct himself and use the pronouns that matched the biological sex, even though it wasn't natural. And that kind of just goes to show how it really is a political act, and it's really not based on anything that's natural or that comes natural to a person. Because even when the person passes completely fine, they're still going to find a way to misgender. When does misgendering happen? That can really depend on the person and the situation that they're in. So, calling from my personal experience, I, again, am early in my transition, and so I get referred to as he, him pretty much every single day, which does cause me discomfort, but I'm also not delusional that, and I know I don't look feminine at the moment to most people when they first see me. That's kind of just something that I have to deal with at this moment, and obviously that's kind of what drives you to want to transition further, is to eliminate that gender dysphoria. I think what's interesting is that for trans people who pass as cisgender, who are later in the transition, a lot of them explain that they never really get misgendered, especially when they're in public, when they go out to the store or they go out to the movies or they're just living their life. People in their lives don't register them as trans, and so they just use the pronouns that the person prefers. Something that's interesting and that multiple trans people recount is that people will misgender them after learning that they're trans, which again, I guess kind of plays into that political ideology. No offense, he is a trans YouTuber and he has a video about a story time of when he was misgendered in a professional setting. There was a reviewer of some kind, I'm pretty sure it was like a company that reviews albums, and this company was reviewing his album and switched pronouns the entire time, even though they knew the fact that Noah was using he, him pronouns. This company was using he, she, and they for this one person, even though that's not the pronouns that they use. And I really do feel like if this company had never known that Noah was transgender, they would have just used his correct pronouns, not even thinking about it. And Noah even talks about in the video how he really doesn't get misgendered in years. Really, he hasn't been misgendered in public because he doesn't register as trans to a lot of people. In terms of what it feels like to get misgendered from a trans person's perspective, again, this is going to range so widely depending on your level of gender dysphoria that you have. And I would say it can range from a slight disruption or a slight annoyance to kind of causing your like mental health to spiral. Of course, that would be like a pretty severe case of gender dysphoria. I would say for most trans people, it really is just kind of a deep discomfort and an annoyance to some degree. But it really just does depend on the intention of the person that is misgendering you. And I found this really funny, but also true TikTok that somebody posted, and I'm going to insert that now.
Being misgendered is not the end of the world, but it just feels like somebody going like, "Hey ugly, I mean your name." Hey ugly, hey ugly, and then you're like, "Can you stop that?" And they're like, "Oh my god, yeah, I'm so sorry, ugly, I mean your name." It's just something that like subtly makes you feel bad. It's just like, okay. And they're like, "Sorry, I can't stop calling you ugly because you look ugly," and my brain automatically defaults to that. And it's like, great, that makes me feel good about myself. It gets jarring too, because you get used to people calling you your name, and then you go home to see your family and they're all like, "Hey ugly," and then on top of that, people who are transphobes like gaslight you, and they're like, "Why does it matter if I call you ugly? You were born ugly. You're mentally ill for not wanting to be called that." And you just have to go through life like that, and it sucks.
I chose this clip pretty much just because of the amount of trans people in the comments that agreed so wholeheartedly, and I also agreed on my own. I think that that was such a perfect way to describe it, and that's exactly what it feels like. It really does just feel like getting called ugly, and there's not much you can do about it. Again, you can correct people, and that can sometimes make them uncomfortable, but you're likely still going to get called ugly the next day, you know? That really is an accurate description of what it may feel like to be misgendered for a lot of trans people. And I do want to read a comment from that video, and I'm going to read it off the screen just so I get it correct. But this was from user @JMs, who said, "It shows me they're not trying to change their perception of my gender. They're just memorizing words to go along with their little game of dress up that they have in their mind," which I think is a really big point that a lot of people miss when it comes to pronoun usage. And so we will get to that in just a second. At the root of what makes misgendering so uncomfortable is not the fact that people are not calling you what you want to be called. It's not about somebody being disrespectful to you, although that can cause annoyance, right? It stems from gender dysphoria. I feel like a lot of cis people may not completely understand, and they do think that trans people are just mad because like a cisgender person won't call them what they want to be called. That's not really the case. The case is that trans people have gender dysphoria. And so again, if you haven't heard much about gender dysphoria, I really highly encourage you to go watch my last video. But any reminder that you look like or you present as the sex that you were assigned at birth for a trans person is going to cause discomfort. Regardless of the intentions behind the person that misgendered you, they could be the sweetest person ever. They could handle it the best way possible. Getting misgendered is still going to cause discomfort either way because you're being reminded that you don't present in the way that you fully want to present as. It sounds weird, but it's really not even about the pronouns. It's just about the perception of gender that comes along with those pronouns. When you call me he, him, it goes so much deeper than the words for me. You're reminding me that I'm a man. That I'm a man, right? Perceptions that come along with those gendered words. You're being perceived as the gender that you don't want to be perceived as, and that's what's causing the discomfort. And as I mentioned, this is really why trans people will still feel a little hurt or feel some discomfort if you misgender them, even if the intentions were completely pure. Unfortunately, if you misgender a trans person and your intentions were good, the trans person's not likely gonna tell you like, that really hurt me. For two reasons. One, because, well, we don't want to make you feel worse than you do already. People really don't like to be corrected, and people really don't like being told that you hurt them when they didn't mean to do anything. People can get quite defensive, and so I think avoiding that interaction altogether is just easiest for any trans person. But just know that when you don't make an effort to use a trans person's proper pronouns, it does hurt a bit, even if you don't mean any harm. That does bring up the good point of like, should I correct people if they make a mistake with my pronouns? And I can't really think of a scenario where you shouldn't correct somebody unless you feel unsafe or uncomfortable doing so. But some like questions that you can think of in order to make that decision is like, have they been told my correct pronouns previously? Will I come into contact with this person again? Were other people around when this person used the wrong pronouns? Did they correct themselves without you saying anything? And how many times have they done it? Again, it's kind of just what you feel in the moment. If you don't feel comfortable in that moment, we live in the digital age, so you can always just message somebody later and say, hey, you called me this and this and this. I would really appreciate if you made an effort to try to use these. Ouch. I would really appreciate if you could make an effort to use these pronouns instead. Surprise, the people in your life probably really aren't that evil, and so they're going to be respectful of you in any way that they can. For cisgender people specifically, some people really struggle to catch on to using the correct pronouns. So I do kind of want to give some tips on how you can make sure that you're trying to learn people's pronouns in the proper way to make the least amount of mistakes as possible. Because again, even if your intentions are good, you can still cause somebody discomfort with your words. I think that the biggest piece of it is like practice, practice, practice. I'm not gonna lie, learning to use they and them in a singular context when you're not used to it at all can be difficult. Like it can be difficult to make that transition to using that at first, but with practice and like deeper thought, you can really change that pretty quickly and you can catch on pretty quickly. With time and practice, you'll get better, but something I really want to stress is try not to memorize people's pronouns like their pronouns are going to be on a test, because that's not really how like language works. That's not really how our brains work. What I recommend is trying to change your perception of this person's gender at the root, not just their pronouns. If this person comes out to you as a trans woman and says that they want to use she, her pronouns, associate feminine things with this person in your head. Think about this person and tell yourself, this person's a woman. She's a woman. She's a woman. She's a woman. She, anything that's traditionally feminine, associate that with her in your head. And you won't really have to think about pronouns as much because it will become second nature. Pronouns really should be second nature. It shouldn't be something that you're having to deeply think about every single time that you're speaking about somebody, because that in itself can kind of be stressful. I would say on top of that, in terms of actually practicing, try speaking about this person either aloud or in your head by yourself. I would recommend to avoid making those mistakes as much as possible. Just do it not around them at first, and then when you do feel more comfortable, there you go. And the last tip I have is for that brief period where you are still trying to learn somebody's pronouns, slow down your speech a little bit, specifically when you're talking about this person, and be mindful when you're speaking, because speaking really is something that we don't even think about after we learn to speak at age 2, but you kind of do have to unlearn those speech patterns in your head. And so, slowing down your speed, if you have to pause before saying the pronoun, that's okay. That's completely fine. It's slow down, think about it beforehand, and then slowly over time, you won't have to think about it anymore because it'll feel natural. So if you do make a mistake, should you apologize for it? What do you think the answer is? So yeah, the answer to that one is a very resounding yes. I will say that one important caveat is you really need to be mindful of how you apologize. And there is kind of an equation that you can use to make sure that you're doing so in a way that's respectful. So there's a TED Talk by Mala Matassin, and she explains the importance of apologizing correctly. And it's basically to avoid a situation in which you way overcompensate by way over apologizing and putting a spotlight on the situation and just profusely apologizing. I didn't mean it, I swear. I don't think of you like that, and blah, blah, blah. That is really overdoing it. And again, your intentions are good and that is appreciated, but you're really, you're putting a spotlight on this situation. You're putting a spotlight on this person. And not only that, but you're kind of drawing out this discomfort of being misgendered for the trans individual. The best way to do it, according to this TED Talk and from personal experience, If you make a mistake, quickly, very quickly say, oh, sorry, I meant he, and then move on. Don't address it. Like, don't, you don't have to do that. And if you say you make like multiple mistakes in one day, you can like message the trans person later and say like, hey, I know I made some mistakes today. Just know I'm working on it. That's that. Just avoid in that moment profusely apologizing, because it's not going to be beneficial for really anybody involved. If you correct yourself, they know you didn't mean it. And so that's just something that's important to keep in mind when interacting with trans people. To drive that point home a little bit more, I do want to say I can't think of a situation in which you make a mistake with somebody's pronouns and you don't apologize for it. That wouldn't really be mindful. That wouldn't really be kind of you to do, but hey, you do you. The last point I want to touch on is cisgender people feeling scared around trans people, or feeling like they're walking on eggshells when it comes to pronoun usage, and being scared that they're going to use the wrong words. Because while there is a lot of transphobia in the media, that's really not what it's like in real life. Most people that you will meet in your everyday life, even if they don't care about trans people at all, will still want to respect you as a person, especially if they know you and they like you and they respect you. They're not going to want to just hurt you. That's not really, that's a politics thing. That's not a real life thing. That's a social media thing. That's not a real life thing. And of course, yes, there's people in real life that are mean and that will want to hurt you, but most of the time that is 100% not the case. But yes, I really do think that some cisgender people are so deathly afraid of making a mistake with somebody's pronouns, and I think that's what leads to this really like dramatic and overdone apology when you make a mistake, because you really want that trans person to know, I did not mean to do that. Just know, again, yeah, you may have caused them discomfort on a deeper level, but they understand logically and rationally you didn't mean to make that mistake. And as long as you acknowledge your mistake, you're completely fine. The trans person is hopefully able to disconnect what they're logically thinking and what they're emotionally feeling, right? And that's the case for, I know myself. If somebody misgenders me and they know the pronouns that I like to use, and then they correct it and apologize, that tells me that they're making an effort, you know? That tells me that they care enough to correct themselves, and it shows that they care to respect me, right? And even though they may have reminded me of something that makes me uncomfortable, I can still logically appreciate that person for owning up to the fact that they made a mistake and working on it. But yeah, I think that is all I have to talk about on misgendering and pronouns. This was kind of a yap fest, but I do think that this is such a hot button topic for a lot of cis and trans people, and so I think it's important to talk about. And like always, if you're trans and you're watching this video, I hope you related to some of the things I said. I hope you agreed with some of the things I said. Of course, feel free to comment down below if you have any differing opinions, or if you really agreed with something. And if you're cisgender and you're watching this video, or if you're watching this video and you really don't agree with gender ideology, I do hope that at least you learned something, because that is the point of this series that I'm doing. I want to make sure that people are grasping what it's like to be trans, what the experience is, and just overall, in general, what it feels like to be trans. So, that is it for this video, and hopefully I'll have a new one out in the next couple weeks.